What's up, guys? I'm Matt Gary, and on this episode of Coding with the Force, I'm going to explain to you what the separation of concerns design principle is and how you can start leveraging it in your Salesforce org. Alright, guys, so in this first episode of this series on separation of concerns, the first thing that I want to really go over with you is why and when you should use separation of concerns in Salesforce environments, what separation of concerns is, and I'm going to show you a simple example of separation of concerns in practice. This is going to be very simplified. I'm not going to show you the Apex Common frameworks yet and some of the more complicated concepts. I just want to drive home the really critical points without getting into some of the more confusing technical implementation of this. When I get into the next couple episodes where we talk more in depth about the specific layers, we'll go over all the more complicated aspects of separation of concerns and, whether or not they're worth it. So, all right, so first thing on this video's list of things to cover, why and when should you actually use separation of concerns? Should you use it in your Salesforce org? The answer to that question is pretty simple in my opinion. If you are in any capacity writing code in your org, you should be leveraging separation of concerns to some extent. Do you necessarily need to be using the Apex Commons framework or something like it? Maybe not. If you're not ever going to blow up into a giant org with lots of different competing projects and stuff like that, maybe not. But you should still use the underlying concepts of separation of concerns for reasons that we'll get into in a little bit. If you are an org that just has configuration, you don't use code at all, there's really not a whole lot of reason to start using separation of concerns. Definitely start organizing your configuration so that it's easier to work with. But Salesforce actually does a lot of the separation of concerns behind the scenes. They implement this practice in their product. So if you're just using configuration, no need to deal with this. There's really no point, to be honest, at least in my opinion. But with that being said, I've been in I think 24, 25 Salesforce instances now. I've never been in one without code. So chances are you should start using this as soon as you can. Why should you start using this as soon as you can? The reason that separation of concerns or leveraging the design principle separation of concerns is useful is for two major purposes. One, it makes it really easy to update your code when you need to in the future. If you have some new business requirement that has to be implemented in your service layer or business layer of logic, if you've leveraged separation of concerns, no problem. Not a problem at all. Literally couldn't be easier. But if you haven't, chances are you're probably going to have to go update code in a whole bunch of different places, and it's going to be a massive pain. The second thing is it reduces the amount of code that you have in your code base. So I've worked in a lot of orgs, and I've come into a lot of bad things. And to be completely honest, I've done plenty of bad things myself when I was a more junior developer. You'll see things like you've got a whole bunch of business layer logic duplicated in multiple, Lightning Web Component Apex controllers or Visual Force controllers or whatever else. And every single time that you need to update some little, some little thing, right, that your business needs changed, you have to go update code in 15 different Apex controllers because for some reason you've put that business logic in every single one of them instead of just putting it in one class and referencing it everywhere. So again, the two biggest benefits you'll see from this are ease of use changing code and a lot less code in your code base. So worth it. It's super worth it if you're going to stay in an org for a long time. Okay, so now that we know what that is, what exactly, now that we know why and when to use separation of concerns, what exactly is separation of concerns? Basically, it's like putting boundaries on your application, or the logic within your application, right? So, for instance, in your code, you've got, you should really have four, let me give another example, right? Let me give a very generic example before I get into code-related stuff. So, say, for instance, you're in a house, right? And you've got 4 people that live in that house. And, they can all live together, but it'd be nice if they had their own boundaries, right? So every person, if you're lucky, gets their own room. And so that one person has a bedroom for them, and then, your mom or your dad or whoever has a room for them, and you separate out your different concerns. So your brother can deal with the concerns in his room, and your sister can deal with the concerns in her room, and you can deal with the concerns in your own room, right? It's kind of thinking like that, but in terms of code. So in code, regardless of whether you're in Salesforce or you are in some other application stack, you really have you have 4 layers typically. And those layers are your presentation layer, your business logic layer, your data access layer, and your database layer. But in Salesforce, we call them, those terms are a little bit different, and I'll explain them in just a second. And it's because they've been coined different by the environment, and most importantly, Andrew Fawcett, who kind of, I suppose, brought all of this to attention in the Salesforce world, and has obviously done quite a few great things for it. So in Salesforce, we still have 4 layers, but we call them things that are a little different. So you still have the presentation layer, but then you have what's called the service layer, the domain layer, and the selector layer. So let's start with the presentation layer. The presentation layer are things like your Visualforce pages with your Apex controllers and your Lightning Web Components, Aura components. And if you're going on the more config side, there are things like layouts and flows and what have you, right? So basically, if we're talking about code anyway, Visualforce, Aura, Lightning Web Components, maybe if you're unlucky, S controls, and Apex controllers. Then you have your service layer, which is basically where all of your business logic resides, right? And you'll put that into what's referred to as an Apex service class. These could also be things like validation rules, or this could be done in workflows too. But so service layer logic is your business layer logic. That's what's important. And then you have your domain-based layer, your domain layer, which is basically, if you have an object and that object always needs a specified set of actions to occur on it, you would put that in the domain layer. And then additionally, you have your apex triggers within the domain layer as well. So your trigger handlers and all that kind of stuff. And then past that, you've got the selector layer, and the selector layer basically acts as a way to query your data, right? So basically, it serves to be an easy way for you to query for data on your various objects, right? It's going to act to kind of simplify that a bit. And then there are other benefits to separating these things into layers too, but we'll get into that layer later. Okay, so again, you've got the layers in Salesforce are as follows. Presentation layer, that's all the wonderful custom Lightning Web Components and things you build. Service layer, that's your business logic, all your business specific code that has to execute. Your domain layer, which again, that is just like your trigger handlers, your triggers, and any default logic that always occurs on an object. And then your selector layer, which just serves to make a very easy way for you to grab data from various objects whenever you need to, right? So you don't duplicate your querying literally everywhere in your code. All right, so now that we've gone over that, let me just show you a very, very simplified example of separation of concerns. Okay, so for this very simple example, I've created a very, very simple Lightning Web Component that sits on the account object and does a couple things. So I'm going to zero this out so we can just see the full effect of this. But basically what this does is it calculates projected opportunity profits based on the opportunities attached to this account. So if I click this button, it generates that 70,500, and then it goes and updates this one opportunity, or sorry, this one account here based on those numbers that we generated from our opportunity. So as this code stands at the moment, what we have is a very simple Lightning Web Component, just a button and paragraph tag, and the button calls this controller, this JavaScript controller method, which in turn calls this controller that has this display projected op profits method. Now, for this brief moment in time, when I've created this is fine. No big deal, right? But now what happens when your trigger needs to be able to call this logic, right? Maybe all of a sudden your trigger needs to start calculating these op profits every once in a while. Or maybe you need a batch job overnight that calculates these op profits as well. Again, this is all theoretical, but you need to do that. Well, technically, I suppose you could call this controller and you could call this method from within the controller, but I don't really know that this screams out to me anyway that this is where my my account service or business logic resides, right? You know what I mean? You don't really just want your business logic lying around in here. Additionally, because of the way that the controller would handle this scenario, we're only passing in one account ID, right? We're accepting a single account ID, which is fine for a Lightning Web Component or an Aura component or a Visualforce page, but it's not really fine when you're trying to bulkify things, right? Ideally, you'd want to pass in like a set of account IDs to be able to, calculate it for all the different opportunities, and you'd want this code to be bulkified, etc., 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 right? So basically what we do to handle this and make it so that we only have to write this code once in one single place, basically, is grab all this code and we'd create an account service layer over here, which I've already created. So we'd create an account service class. Again, this is a very, very simple implementation. We're not going over Apex Commons yet, which will get a little bit more complicated. But just for a basic understanding here, we've got our account service class, which is theoretically going to house our business logic. And we're sending it in a set of account IDs instead of just one single ID. And I've already updated this query so that now instead of it just looking for that one ID, it's looking for all the account IDs. Now you'd have to update this for loop too, so that you only calculated things for the account ID for that specific account, right? And you'd have to change the way that these total net profits are being calculated. There's a lot of things that you need to change, right, for this to work in a bulkified manner. But once you got that in place, you'd be able to have this one method for this service, for your account that would be able to calculate these opportunity profits for everywhere in your system, not just here in this controller, right? And that might not seem like a big deal right now. If you're just building a brand new Salesforce instance and you only have it, a couple things in there. But I guarantee at some point, if you don't do this now, you'll likely have to do this in the future, where you have to take what you built in some controller that you've made and put it into a service class to bulkify it, and bulkify it so that anything can potentially access it and deal with and get data returned to it. And if you don't structure it in this way, you're going to have, multiple places where you do this exact same logic over and over and over again, right? You're going to have a new controller eventually that needs to grab these profits. You're going to have the batch class, like I said before, that needs to generate these profits, among lots of other things. Additionally, when you only have one place where these things are calculated, it's easier to go update them, right? Now I've just got this one account service where I calculate these things in a bulk fashion, and if I ever need to update it, right, I've just got this one method. It's just this one method now. I can come to it. I know that just this one method in the service class that has all of my business logic in it is where to go to update this particular function, no matter where I am, whether I'm on a controller, whether I'm in a batch class, whether I'm in a trigger, wherever I might be, I come here to update the logic. And if you're doing integrations with Salesforce, then this becomes even more important, right? Would you really want an integration looking to a controller for a Lightning Web Component? No. If something was integrating with your instance, you'd ideally want it to connect to something like this business layer, this service layer that could, allow it to calculate opportunity profits or whatever that might be, right? And so now, if we came back to this controller, right, and we use this account service, which I realize this code isn't technically bulkified yet, but you get the picture, right? You could just say something as simple as this. You could do return account service dot calculate projected opportunity profits. Then you'd say new set IDs and give it the account ID. And that's it. You could also, put this in a try catch block now. Something like that. Oh my gosh, I gotta fix my gotta fix my autocomplete for this project. And you could do something very simple to say, throw new aura handled exception, and then have that return to the controller, right? So pretty very simple stuff, but it just makes your code a lot easier to reuse. And I know this is a very simple example, and in the videos that are upcoming, where I'll go over each individual layer, the domain layer, the service layer, the selector layer, this will get a lot more complicated, and we'll go over a lot more advanced topics. But just as a very simple introduction here, this is why this is beneficial, because then everywhere you just kind of call this one place. It's all in this one centralized location. Making updates to this centralized location is simple. And when you start using interfaces and other patterns with this code, it actually becomes easier and easier and easier and easier to just replace this code whenever you want to replace it. But anyway, simple example. So hopefully this has kind of helped you grasp how this can be beneficial if you move to start leveraging it in your code base within your Salesforce org. In the next lesson, we're going to go over the domain selector, the domain layer for separation of concerns within Salesforce. So yeah, hopefully I'll see you around for that. It's going to get a little bit more complicated, but I'm going to keep it as simple as I can so that, maybe these concepts aren't as crazy as people, I think, make them seem. All right, guys, that's it for this episode. I hope you all enjoyed it. Be sure to subscribe if you want more Salesforce related development tutorials, and don't forget to vote on the next beginner tutorial set that I do in the community tab of the YouTube channel. Super important. You want to see what you want to see? Go vote. Just do your thing. All right, guys, I will see you later. Bye-bye.